I am gonna level with everyone. I'm struggling with this. With even starting this. I really, really like Final Fantasy. I still contend that every mainline entry to the series is really good. Like, they all showcase an incredible amount of creativity and passion, and they're never afraid to really reinvent the system and change things. Also, as the series keeps progressing, they do this really cool thing and seem to make their stories way less interested in, like, old high fantasy tropes and look at injustice, collectivism, revolution. You know, these games can often be quite radical. And if I were some kind of deeply cynical takedown essayist, I'd pivot and be all like, but, you know, then Final Fantasy VII Remake ruined my dreams, crushed my spirit, and killed my family. It didn't. Like, obviously from the title this is going to be critical of FF7R, but I really want to make sure that everyone watching understands that I'm coming at this in a very uncomfortable position because I fundamentally agree with what the game is trying to do. I really like, as a matter of principle, that this remake is ambitious and trying to genuinely play with and re-examine the source material, and I don't want my critique of such to be taken as, you know, remakes should always be faithful to the source material, because I don't think that's true. I do think, however, that it is important to actually look at something like this remake, because it's a good case study, and, you know, it's from a series I love, and that's branding. And before we really dig into it, a lot of the things I'm going to be critical about aren't even really glaring issues with the game as is. FF7R plays well. It's fun, vibrant, pretty to look at, the gameplay is satisfying, but its worst issues all come from the context around the game. I've had multiple friends tell me, and I kind of agree, that if this was a game constructed in the same way, but it wasn't called, you know, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 1, it would make a great addition to the series on its own. The issues I'm getting at with the game are contextual and weird, and I'm running a real risk of coming at this issue like I'm in love with the original game, but please trust me, I am trying to be as fair as possible here, so let's get started. So for the unaware, Final Fantasy VII was, in many ways, one of the most iconic installments in the Final Fantasy series. It was huge when it released, and in many ways the aesthetic, the style, the ridiculous parts, the good parts, the tragic parts have been embedded in the broader cultural perception of, if not all JRPGs, at the very least Final Fantasy as a whole. We know the big swords, the ridiculous anime hair, the tragic death scene, Sephiroth, you know, it's all kind of this big famous part of FF's history, which inevitably leads into a pushback with a lot of folks considering the game overhyped and underwhelming and blah blah blah. This is all old news. Any popular thing is going to have detractors. Anyone can look up Final Fantasy VII and know about its history. We all get it. The point here is that the remake carried a big promise up front, and it all seemingly has its roots in this trailer they did back in the late 1700s.
We're paying you more than a few gil. You best be worth it.
Look, I don't care about your politics.
This trailer scratched an itch in the community. Everyone was thirsty for this version of Final Fantasy VII, but pretty. Which is to say, for as iconic a game as FF7 is, looking at it now, well, it certainly shows its age. Like, the English translation was shoddy, the graphics are blocky and weird, it seems a little slapdash for American audiences, so the idea of a version of this game, but with Square Enix's more modern aesthetic quality, you know, the idea of it is this highly detailed, beautiful rendition of this game to have, you know, before us a genuine representation of the images we had in our head as children, is a tempting concept. And now we sort of have that. You know, the game is straight up, no joke, gorgeous. It's lovingly, meticulously crafted, and it's not like this is some sparse, open, high fantasy FF game of Eld. Nay, my lads, Midgar is this sprawling, massive, imposing visual metaphor of class inequity. In fact, if you want a really good video essay on Midgar, particularly in FF7R, please watch Jacob Geller's video on it. It's genuinely fantastic. I highly recommend it, and I don't really think much of what I'm here to talk about in this essay contradicts that one, so fair's fair. I'm not here to retread old ground, but I think it's important to think about what sort of audience the creators of this game were expecting when they began to make it, because there's a lot of work seen in the remake that kind of gestures towards the expectation of Final Fantasy VII, but pretty. And we'll get to that. Now, as fascinating as it must be to pick apart the psychology of fandoms or whatever, it really isn't my forte to speculate wildly on what fans may be thinking. Like, I'm not here to engage in whether or not FF7R has connected Advent Children, Crisis Core, Dirge of Cerberus, Kingdom Hearts, Final Fantasy Tactics, Super Smash Bros., Mario Kart Racing, and Tamagotchi together. I'm looking at this game on its face. I also don't have a PS5 and refuse to listen to anyone who tries to tell me where to get the Intergrade DLC, so I'm sorry, Yuffie. Maybe next time. This is going to be a really weird one for me to go after, honestly. There's a lot I want to say positively about it, even if I'm here to be critical, and at times it's going to feel like a bit like I'm going to drift into a lot of unfair comparisons to the original title. I'm going to try to avoid that, but at the heart of my issue with this game is honestly how it understands its source material. And, oh god, what the hell am I getting myself into? Okay, look. Kind of at the crux of this is that FF7 is kind of blessed to have been made in a world where FF7 didn't exist. It's a goofy story in a lot of ways, to be sure, and the iconic bits of it are all there, but it didn't live under the shadow of itself like the remake does. FF7 didn't come to this world with everyone knowing about Sephiroth and his weird obsessions, about Zack and his very special sword, about, Was that Advent Children about something? Like, I've seen it, but the only thing I remember was Tifa's fight in it. The point is, the remake is entering into this conversation with a ton of stuff in the cultural context of Final Fantasy VII specifically, and in an effort to make this remake its own thing, like a twist on the original story, it tries to wrap all of these things into itself. It's literally trying to rewrite the original game into a world with, 3 games and a movie that have iterated on itself. And while, again, I do think that remakes, if we're going to live in the hell of companies going out of their way to rehash our childhoods and serve it up to us for exorbitant prices while quietly sunsetting access to the very literal games we remember— I'm losing focus. Anyway, if we're remaking games forever, I agree on principle that there should be something substantive brought to the table. So, does FF7R do that? Kind of. See, I want to bring up that the major thematic thrust of FF7R is destiny, right? Like, the Whispers, the new big villain of the game, are here to try and force the events in this game to go the same way as the original, and our tenacious party members fight their own fate to carve out their own destiny. Cool. Great. With you so far. This is an awkward position for the story, though, for a few reasons, and I think the most obvious, and maybe the weakest issue, is that destiny as a central theme wasn't really the focus of the original. See, the original could be interpreted to be about destiny in some ways, but that's not really the kind of energy I've gotten out of the game, as much as it seems to be like nature, right? Like, we open with this central question about the planet, about Mako energy, with our heroes committing eco-terrorism, and even when Sephiroth consumes the role of main villain, and it, feels like we're ramping into this big fated conflict, at the heart of it is Meteor, the meteor that Sephiroth summoned that will literally destroy the planet. Cloud's group, Hojo, and Shinra all have their own perspectives on the conflict, and, part of the fun about Shinra, as an aside, is in watching this hyper-capitalistic force try and fix a problem they created by using more Mako, more money, expending more lives, and all of it does nothing. What solves this apocalypse is Holy, the spell Aerith cast at the Sealed Forest that resonated with the planet and protects it. We're not here to muse on what is Cloud's destiny by any kind of divine right. There is no prophecy, no sublime determination on what Cloud is supposed to do. Cloud does what he believes he should as he understands who he is. That's a terrible sentence, but what I mean to say is that Cloud, so he doesn't have amnesia so much as he has memories in his head that aren't his own. He thinks he's part of Soldier, this elite military branch, and he thinks he was sent to Nibelheim, his hometown, as Sephiroth's partner, and he acts for a large portion of the game on that understanding of who he is. Now, here's a hot button issue. Aerith dies. Spoilers, I know, but the thing is that she sort of saves the world in doing so, and this is where I kind of really want to push back on destiny as a big central theme. It's a very small moment near the end of the game where Cloud and Tifa are talking about Aerith. Cloud says that she went off to the forest, to the Temple of the Ancients, whatever, ready to die for everyone. And Tifa replies that she thinks he's wrong. She wasn't ready to die, because every time the two of them talked, Aerith was always, talking about places she wanted to visit and people she wanted to spend time with, things to do, fun to have, and concludes that she thinks maybe Aerith wanted to live more than anyone. And that little moment both broke my dumb little heart, because I'm an emotional baby, and I think is a pretty damning foil to the concept of destiny, particularly as it's portrayed in the remake. See, Aerith didn't go to die in the forest. I think the Temple of the Ancients is actually the pyramid one. The forest, it doesn't matter. She didn't go to die there because of some prophecy or divine issue. She knew what would happen if Sephiroth got the black materia, and she knew how to fix it, and she's the only one who could, not because, she's innately special, but because she's the last of her people, and her mother gave the only thing that would actually save the world from oblivion to her. This also didn't require a life sacrifice, she had to pray in the temple or the forest or whatever to invoke the holy materia, and Sephiroth tried to stop her before it happened. It feels like a shallow way to go about it, right? To look at all of this and conclude either that the game has always been about destiny, or that making this game about destiny would be a good, interesting way to interpret it. And that is kind of the heart of the argument. The central thesis put forward by FF7R seems to be at genuine odds with the source material, because by making it about destiny, the game is less exploring a new, interesting lens, and more tipping their hat to the fans of the property. The big dramatic questions of will Cloud find himself, and how will we stop Meteor, are replaced instead with, will this version of the game go the same way as the original? So the tricky thing about making a remake of any property is that you have to, on some level, contend with the existence of the original. Final Fantasy VII still exists, and unlike a lot of older games where there's no legitimate way of obtaining and playing them now unless you have hundreds of dollars you need to get rid of as soon as possible, you can play a slightly edited version of the original, like now, on Steam. They got rid of a few typos in the script, but it's more or less the same game that was released on the PS1. This whole thing is to say that 7R is in a weird position here, because there's a lot of expectations put upon the game, some of which do stem from all of the related material that now exists, sure, but also structural as well, as a result of how they split the game into this, episodic thing. FF7R only covers maybe the first, 5 hours of the base game? We'll get to that too, but you can see that the idea, the concept of making the game about destiny, may not be so much of a fundamental failure to understand the source material, as much as it was something that they could use as a through line to get us, through the extended version of the very start of the original game. FF7R, as it stands, can't really take in the overall burden of the original by nature of being episodic, part 1 of a series, so this part 1 has to be about something that is both satisfying to the person playing the game, while not going far beyond the story, within reason, considering all the Sephiroth and cutaways to a scene deep in Disc 2, but whatever. So, okay. I've been meandering, and I'm sorry, no one likes long videos, but I'm trying to break down a lot of things, and when I get down to it, making FF7R about Destiny is symptomatic of them structuring it this way. And once we consider that, everything else kind of starts to undo itself. And let's start with Okay, Red 13. Everyone's favorite red dog. So, in the original game, Red 13 joins the party in the raid of the Shinra building, which is right near the end of the Midgar section, which is fine in the original, but in the remake, that's the very end of the game. They can't cut him out of the game, obviously, but he can't be a party member in the same way that the other 4 characters have been this entire time, so what they end up doing is kind of putting him in there in this weird way, where he's like a guest party member, but you can't see his stats, his equipment, control his actions in the game, none of it, because it wouldn't make sense for them to give you a party member at that point, even as that leads to a different issue in that, like, okay, by the time you get Red 13 in the original, that's when you're given a little more discretion on building a party. You have 5 characters, parties have to be 3 characters max, so you can pick and choose who you like, watch the narrative split your team up, you know, it's neat. But it's also a function in the game that you can't introduce at the very, very end of it, and they also don't have a lot of meaningful variety in the party members you do get. It hardly feels like you have a ton of options to make if the party size is 3 and you have 4 characters to pick from twice ever, and one of the characters has to be in the party. So when they reach these issues, which, again, these are issues imposed upon itself, they've built ways around ever having to make you actually customize your party much at all. Like, the final boss sequence makes your party for you based on how you fight in it, I think, without ever really telegraphing how you're doing it. Like, there is a method to it, of course, but it's never stated clearly, so you spend the entire time playing a game based on, you know, a Final Fantasy title with, like, what, 9 characters total you can pick and choose from? You spend this one with a fixed party in fixed locations, going from fixed chapter to chapter, feeling like there's no real say you get to have in the basic elements of an RPG, even without pointing out that these are elements pretty front and center in the original, and another FF title I've maybe mentioned on this channel, FF13. So, okay. Remember how everyone hates the first half of FF13 because you have no control over your party and are walking from linear objective to linear objective, and how that game structurally forces you to comply with it, all the way up until right before you completely reject the world you live in and escape it to Pulse, where, you know, you suddenly get full control over the development of everyone involved. That thing that everybody knows about FF13 and is so common I didn't have to make a video on it. FF7R feels like the first half without the second, while gesturing at the idea that you're here to break free from your destiny while being given fairly trivial control over your party. Like, sure, you can equip whatever weapons or material you want on your team, but your team is fixed, the story is fixed, the side quest areas, while nice, are ephemeral and vanish once you return to the plot, and a lot of these decisions feel like they were reached from looking at the game mechanically first, and then retrofitting a thematic center onto them afterward. The game would feel unsatisfying to play if it tried to recreate the exact progression of the original, where the party is low-leveled, with barely enough materia to go around, just learning about party customization, and figuring out that everyone on your team has a unique quality to them that they can contribute with, so instead, they restructure the mechanics to force party comps, give you the same kind of progression you'd get out of a regular title, so you reach the end of Midgar with thousands of HP, a stockpile of materia, summon spirits, loan bricks, weapons, skills, etc., and they even go so far as to what I found to be maybe the most important, the most annoying thing, actually. Have you fight Sephiroth at the end. Here he is. It's the boy. So, okay, look. Sephiroth is a mess. I actually looked up his FanWiki article to get a sense of how on earth I'd summarized one of the most iconic Final Fantasy villains ever, and all I learned is that, one, there are so many more related things in the FF7 universe. Comics, books, like all sorts of stuff. It's terrible. And two, I don't care. What I do want to focus on, since I hope those of you watching at home can comprehend Sephiroth as a big villain that's very strong, is how he's used in the two versions of FF7. In the original, he's mentioned here and there during the Midgar segment, like he's talked about in these kind of ambiguous ways, venerated as a war hero, Cloud has some kind of tension around him, Hojo casually dismisses Cloud's bragging about being a soldier first class because it's meaningless unless you're another Sephiroth, and the first concrete piece of evidence that we get of seeing him in action is when the President, who at this point has seized your entire party and put you in prison cells you can't escape from, is shown dead with Sephiroth's massive fuck-off sword sticking out of him. The first time you actually see him in the game proper is through a flashback dictated by Cloud, where Sephiroth is a party member who utterly destroys every enemy you encounter without batting an eye. The next time you have evidence of him doing a pursuit, okay, so pretty early on after leaving Midgar, you have to cross this swamp to get to this mine, but lurking in the swamp is a completely massive snake called the Midgar Zalam, capable of one-shotting your entire party with a single spell. Yikes! But when you do spend the time to catch a chocobo, ride it across the swamp, avoid the snake, and get to the mine, what do you see? Boom. There's a Midgar Zalam skewered over a tree like it's nothing. Sephiroth. The game sets up these moments bit by bit, piece by piece, to escalate how utterly terrifying a presence he is, so that when he does actually try and stop your party's plans after you've been dealing blow after blow to Shinra, he straight up kills one of your party members for good. In contrast, Sephiroth shows up right after the first mission in 7R, and pops up several times after that, over and over, popping in here and there to talk about how important Cloud is to him, about his destiny, about anger, about all sorts of things. He stabs Barrett, but, you know, it's fine, he's fine. He's there on top of President Shinra's body, and he is, as I said, the final boss of the game. Like, there are more parts of this game, right? Like, we're just gonna end every segment of the game fighting Sephiroth again and again? Actually, we should. We should just have everybody fight Sephiroth. Every Final Fantasy game now ends with the Sephiroth final boss. Let's just fucking go for it. This kind of framing weakens what the original succeeded at, because he just keeps showing up, and he's there because you can't make a Final Fantasy title in this day and age and not have Sephiroth in it. So it's this massive appeal to the fans that, you know, you get to fight Sephiroth in this new battle system with new pretty graphics, and yet this choice cannot help but feel like a cheap appeal. So, okay, I have the basic construction of the argument, right? Like, they made a lot of structural, thematic, and narrative changes in the game to make a compelling, fuller experience out of the original opening few hours of the game, and stretching that out and putting Sephiroth all over it makes it feel underwhelming. If that was the extent of it all, I wouldn't have wasted your time listening to my really genuinely unfocused brain spin its wheels over this, and I wouldn't continue to do so now, but the smoking gun in this essay is that FF7R is also really, really good in a lot of ways. Like, I mentioned the combat being fun, and Jacob Keller's video, sure, but there's a lot of this game that does genuinely work out strongly in its favor. I'm gonna start out with a fun one, actually. So, okay. The Honeybee Inn was an optional place to visit during the minigame where Cloud dresses up in drag to infiltrate Don Corneo's mansion, where, you know, the good old Don takes pretty women and forces them into sex with him and his boys. Great. The minigame is clearly dated in a lot of ways. It's not exactly, like, appropriate trans representation ooh-woo, but it's good fun, and you can have a very serious soldier or Cloud flirt with Don Corneo and call Barrett his boyfriend and have a heavily suggested man orgy, which is great, I think. Don't worry about it. This isn't necessarily to say that FF7 was hugely problematic and FF7R, you know, fixed it, but this reimagining of it is just fun. I love it. I love it so much. 7R does a lot of good things more substantive than, you know, Cloud transcending gender via interpretive club dance. I really do like the stuff they added, and the design choices they made for a lot of Midgar. Like, not every choice and decision, but, you know, a lot of them. It's a difficult thing to translate, honestly, the visual idea of such an extreme sort of inequity, and in a lot of places that really does shine. Navigating through the underplate carries that kind of industrial grit, the way the artificial light in close quarters shines on Barrett's sweaty body, and I think the expansion of Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge was mostly great. Like, they definitely feel distinct and fuller, and they help make the game feel richer, which it sorely needs considering the imposition the creators put on themselves to make this a part one of many. The combat is also great. Like, each character plays very uniquely, and it's genuinely fun getting to explore the world, to fight with them, to hear some pretty fantastic voice acting. Aerith is fun to make memes about. Cloud's VA threaded a very, very precarious needle of, like, Cloud being both a stoic soldier man and also kind of a goofy weirdo. Barrett's VA had kind of an uphill battle trying to make such a bombastic, out-there character feel both, you know, big and have some really touching emotional depth. Like, there's a lot to love in this game, and I'm not here to diminish that, per se. The only major issue in all of this is, like, a lot of the good decisions, the loving detail of Midgar, the ideas expressed in trying to address the old themes and complexities presence. In a lot of ways, it's an almost entirely new experience, but a lot of these experiences kind of run counter to a lot of what made the original really great. And in some ways that's fair. Like, again, the honeybee dance is just the best, but in trying to lean in hard on this sense of realism, on the extra time we have with all of the early game characters, you know, the new characters they had to make, a lot of it can end up undermining a lot of what I really connected to in the original. And because this essay is already a giant mess, we're gonna be comprehensive here, so, let's do that. So, around the time it came out, there was this perception, perhaps one that hasn't survived a year into the future, I'm not very good at staying topical, that FF7R took a lot of steps to fix the shortcomings presented in the original. People's perspectives on that differ, with Kotaku saying that the new combat fixed the original's ATB turn-based affair, Polygon talking about how the new Honeybee Inn fixes the problematic original take on it. There was some media buzz that I remember making me, like, miserable that said that I can't for the life of me remember where it came from, but there was this idea that the remake is addressing the issues, failings, weaknesses of the original and making them better, filling in the script that they cut from the original, stuff like that. I can sort of see why that idea would work, but I think that going into this remake with the perspective that it can, should, and will fix the problems of the original can be a fraught venture. Let's start with one of the first changes they made. I'm leaving things like the additions of the Whisperers or the sheer concentrated amount of Sephiroth off the table here because they're less about fixing FF7 and more about, you know, constructing a coherent narrative for a full release. We already talked about that. So, at the start of both versions of the game, Cloud is on a mission with Avalanche, blowing up the reactor, fine and dandy so far. But they did a small thing in the remake that it almost instantly got under my skin, in that the bomb, once you escape, gets detonated by Shinra covertly. And they, like, go out of their way to blow up their own reactor. This is such a weird turn, and I do get kind of where they're coming from. Like, look, the message of Avalanche is, on the surface of things, a good one, right? Like, the planet is dying, and human industry is destroying it. If we want to live on the planet, we need to get rid of Shinra, blow up the reactors, so on and so forth, and that's fine. You know, good, even, but these actions do have very real consequences, right? Like, it may be a necessary one, but it's irresponsible to pretend that just because it's the right thing to do to stop Shinra, blowing up a reactor could cost people real harm, lives lost, families struggling without power, all of it. And in the original, that conflict isn't really neatly addressed initially, and a lot of that is because, you know, Cloud, the main character, starts from a position of apathy. He kind of is just here for a paycheck, right? So on the one hand, it does make sense to want to focus on this more and try and draw stronger opening statements on the inherent political thought behind it, but the decision the writers reached is almost baffling. Like, okay, the bomb was set up to blow the reactor, and Shinra not just, like, detonates it for us, but they do it in a way that it creates an even bigger explosion than intended. This can create a neat little bit of character drama with Jessie, who didn't understand how it happened, and takes the blame for it, which leads to the little mission you go with her on the surface. Like, all of that is fine. But if we're trying to re-examine the thinking around Shinra, what it represents, and why it's important to fight them, to go to such lengths, this beat is so odd. Like, they do this twice. Also, they blow up their own reactors, 2 of them, in order to twist the knife in Avalanche, and I can kind of get where they're going, right? Like, they don't care about the people who need Mako to maintain their lives as is, and will use their suffering as a cudgel against their enemies. That part makes sense, but, like, it hits so odd, because this isn't just using the suffering of the people. These reactors are how the company has worked and maintained profits, right? Like, if we were taking the idea that this action is supposed to clarify the politics of the game, I kind of disagree, because not only do you have a company literally hamstringing itself in ways that are both unnecessary and grossly unprofitable, but you both have them pin several things on Avalanche instead of the one big thing from the original, dropping Sector 7 and killing everyone in it, and as a result, we have characters who will gladly shoulder the responsibilities of actions they never made. Jessie feels bad, believing that she's the cause of all the death that happened after the reactor blew, so you get to have her both be affected by it, while preserving her from an actual ethical dilemma. She didn't actually kill anyone with her bomb, she just gets to feel like she did. Actually, let's take a moment here to talk about how the remake did the pillar sequence, because it is a shocking vertical slice of a lot of my issues with the game. Like, on one hand, there are some moments in the sequence that, no joke, absolutely work. Aerith struggling to get to 7th Heaven to get Marlene out before the plate falls is excellent. You get these really lovely character beats where she helps a child, she helps Marl coordinate an evacuation effort, Wedge is alive, let's put a pin in that, and by the time she gets there, she has to talk to a child who doesn't know her, and then she negotiates Marlene's safety with Song. Like, I don't know, there's just a lot that really works. Similarly, the Biggs and Jessie moments on the pillar are really well crafted and excellently performed. When it comes to these little moments where the remake gets to flesh out the original sequence a little, it really shines. It knows how to dig into the empathy generated for this lovable cast. And on the other hand, Cloud beats Reno and Rude. Like, it's rescripted from the original to be a race to start the plate drop, and instead of the original, where the plate was already starting to drop and your efforts to fight Reno and Rude are just kind of them fucking with you a bit before they give up and get going, now it's this desperate fight, and you beat the shit out of them. Like, so much so that the Whispers, the invisible hand of fate rendered visible, have to force you to lose at the end. And to compound on this, Reno now holds a grudge against you because you already beat him once and now he just fucking hates you and wants to keep fighting you, which in itself is fine, but the charm of Reno and Rude are undermined because, like, I don't know, wasn't that the joy of the Turks? Like, that they were this cool group that seemed almost disinterested in physically fighting you? So, instead, the Whispers have to make you lose, make you escape, and as the game works its magic, it makes this hyper-realistic part of the city collapse into fire, ash, and twisted metal. Oh hey, Kate Sith. Yeah, like, hey fans, remember Kate Sith, the toy cat that's here now on his knees in dramatic anime fashion, punching the ground in despair, like... Why is this happening now? Like, we've already had scenes with Reeve, right? Like, Kate Sith's operator, like, he's out here hand-wringing so much in this game to ensure you guys, like, when he betrays the party in Disc 7 or whatever later on, it's okay. He's a good guy. Look at how sad he is. Oh, God. There are some subtler, similar changes that work to undermine what was a very blunt, clear metaphor for inequity, and one in particular I think worth noting is the addition of the sun lamps. The things you're shutting off in the second reactor mission. Now, the lamps are explained as a gesture from Shinra to placate the underclass, and I do get that, and this will all actually build to a surprise point further on. God, like, this essay is just so fucking long. But it's a very odd thing to employ in a game that really made use of the kind of limitations of the platform it was on. And one of that was being able to set a tone that, in the light of extremely modern visual design in games, would be obviously unrealistic. Like, natural sunlight would inevitably make it through the gaps in the plate, right? And come in from the sides and all that. But the visual tone of the slums in the original felt, Okay, so, you know how in Jacob Geller's video on FF7R, the one that I think is good and you should watch, where he talks about Mary King's Close, the old town area in Scotland that had the Royal Mile built on top of it? I feel like the actual visual resemblance to that real actual place is more clear in the original, because there is no natural light until you leave Midgar. The first 5 hours of the game is set under harsh, artificial reds, greens, neons. It feels viscerally like you're trapped, very literally, in the underground. The industrial design of the original is far less realistic, far less grounded in the kind of actual technical design something as expansive and daunting as Midgar would likely need. But that was the joy of the original game, right? So, cashing in the surprise hot take now, like the one about light, or whatever, not about the one about Tifa, but the limitations of the PS1 forced the entire team to craft the game around them. And as a result, there's this undeniable heart of the story that exists in the highly unreal world of the original. Let's look at, for example, flashbacks. See, often in the story, we'll have flashbacks, as stories tend to do, but in the PS1, the game didn't really have a lot of visual depth to make a lot of them feel super distinct in the way we may think of a flashback in a video game now. This wasn't the kind of design a more sprite-oriented title like earlier Final Fantasies, so the language used in VII was in many ways even more restrictive than maybe it needed to be. So, what did they do instead? Well, if the flashbacks weren't always going to be the most visually distinct, why not make a main character with a specific issue with his own memory, his sense of self, you know, all of that. That's why we get so many scenes in the original that are so disorienting. Why Cloud's overlaid with himself in specific breakdowns, because it's how they could convey to us that he is very literally at odds with himself. This is what I find so compelling and fun about the original, because it didn't exist in the context of having a ton of associated properties to field deep lore questions, to tell us about Cloud's cool sword, about Zack, about Vincent, about, really, what was Advent Children about? Like, why did this guy beat Tifa? It makes me fucking miserable every time. The writing synergizes with the medium it's being written for. This is why I like a lot of the visual design in FF13 and 15, because they are gorgeous and highly detailed, and were made on platforms that could shoulder that visual burden, and the stories complement the burden that, like, the games were built around. What the remake contributes, almost as a result of this effort to re-render Midgar in this loving detail, is that it kind of de-queered it. Okay, hear me out, please. The slums of Midgar in the original, the one saturated in artificial light, made out of the garbage dropped from up top, is full of these characters that are kind of aberrant. Like the guy who lives on the train, like the people living in pipes. Hell, Wall Market is coded as this place full of bitter, downtrodden gays fighting over wigs and cosmetics. The idea of Cloud cross-dressing Bicon is accepted kind of readily. In the remake, sure, there's more natural light, there's the politically baffling sun lamps, but the people all look, normal, so to speak. Like people you'd see on the street or in a subway, which both makes Cloud, anime character with big sword, stand out like a sore thumb, but it also kind of scrubs the slums of its unique, deviant charm. Wall Market isn't the place where degenerate queers like me go, it's just like a busy night city. Like, why did you get rid of all the gays? In contrast to the remake, which does have the burden of the property being re-examined so much, the original had to kind of make decisions that only affected its own story. Like, it's still clunky in many ways as a result, sure, but working within both the limitations of the technology and the lack of an expanded universe means that decisions have to be made in service of its own material, right? Cloud struggles with his sense of memory, his sense of self, so they overlay a bunch of translucent clouds atop him when he's having a moment where he can't really make sense of his head. It looks like all conflicting interpretations of him are struggling to put themselves back together. The remake's efforts here are in many ways admirable. Like, they have a tough job trying to translate a lot of stylistic choices made in the original into something as naked and bare as the highly detailed, verisimilitudinous world of Midgar that they created. You can see it in a lot of conventional cinematic language, abrupt cutaways, an attempt to weave Nibelheim into Midgar during Cloud's hallucinations, but in a lot of ways, the high level of intricate detail can't help but destroy ambiguity. Like, as much as you can tell that Cloud's having highly real hallucinations, he's become more of a subject to look at, someone you can witness having a hallucination, rather than someone who you are experiencing hallucinations with. So, we have characters who have to change and expand to fit the new structure of the remake, a game that exponentially fills out this one tiny part of the original, which by necessity gives it a new villain, a different plot to incorporate them, all of that, and I've been pretty egalitarian, sort of, about these changes. That's my phone, by the way. Your phone is fine. I can see why a lot of them are necessary, except Sephiroth, and while I feel like a lot of them are ill-fitting, I really can understand why they happened. But a side effect to all of this is what happens to some of these characters in order to shoulder the burden of the new story, namely what happens to Tifa, Aerith, and Red 13. This also sort of happens to Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie, though I don't mind most of that stuff because they did need to be bigger, more distinct characters, and the fact that some of them may still be alive in Part 2 is just baiting us for the next release. So, Tifa's deal is a lot, honestly, when it comes to how the remake handled her. I don't have any weird objections about her VA or, I guess her tits, because that was something capital G gamers got mad about. Thanks, guys. But my issues are tricky to get through, so, let's start at the beginning. So, initially, I didn't like the character choices they went with for Tifa. In the original, she always seemed a little more collected, like secretive, yes, but like someone who was more just trying to quietly watch over Cloud and maybe try to figure out what happened to him. In the remake, she's so painfully in love with him, so cloyingly supportive. In her own right, it's a fine enough take on the character, but she's also here to be the moral compass of Avalanche, and suddenly have parts of the game where she talks about how much she hates violence, and, she doesn't want to hurt people, and, again, the part of me that loved the original hears this and thinks about the same Tifa that charged headlong at Sephiroth with his own blade, a scene so iconic that they retrofitted it into the remake. The Tifa that survived fighting Sephiroth and went on to learn super deadly martial arts from a wandering master or whatever. And, really, I don't know. Tifa, Cloud's babysitter, feels like such an odd take for a character that refuses to be honest with herself, that is clearly worried about him, sure, but is just trying to keep him around long enough to maybe get a moment alone with him, maybe find out what happened, and it just feels so weird that they missed that her affection, her feelings are things that she's kept locked, maybe in her heart, like Tifa Lockhart being a bit closed off and expressing her concerns, just, whatever. Why did they do this? Again, I sincerely doubt that the answer is that the people are bad at writing. I think the answer is that they wanted Avalanche's position to be complicated, right? It's the reason why we have the entire part of the story that's visiting Jessie's parents up top so she can smuggle new supplies for her bomb to try to ensure that, more innocent people don't get killed in explosions she thinks she caused. The writers want us to feel the conflicting desires of Avalanche, the idea that we want to care for people, even people that are accomplices to Shinra's exploitations, while still finding it necessary to fight them to save the planet. They want to feed us this pleasant idea of there being a morally clean way to revolt against a dominant exploitative power. And I get that it's a fantasy, and that can make it an easier thing to digest, but it really compromises a lot to get there, and the game wants to be this nuanced take on environmentalism, but looking at it this way, it feels like finding the heart of the message, which is, I think, I think is that we should extend empathy to people even while they work for the enemy gets a little lost because we don't have a character that makes that distinction. Like, Tifa doesn't really explain why she's a part of Avalanche, a group of violent eco-terrorists, if she hates violence. Like, it weakens her character both by turning her into this kind of cloying, bleeding heart pseudo-mom for Cloud, and by making it unclear what she's even doing here outside of looking out for Cloud, someone who presumably got to Midgard recently enough that she needed to show him around and get him a place to live, which means, considering that her bar is a secret headquarters of Avalanche, like it literally has a secret underground base built into it, that she must have been in Avalanche well before Cloud got here, so what is she doing here? Like, why is she okay supporting a group that is openly violent if she doesn't like it on principle? Look, I hate being this kind of traditionalist, and I also feel like it's immature and maybe even flat out incorrect to chalk these changes up to the writers just fundamentally misunderstanding Tifa, when I think the heart of the problem is a matter of interpretation. What do I mean? Okay, so the original FF7 had no voice acting. It was on the PS1, and I don't think Legend of Dragoon was out then, I don't know, but they went without voice acting as a series until FF10, which fine, frankly, but the effect of it, of characters that don't have the kind of expressive nature the sprite era of Final Fantasy did, made the dialogue feel more like a book. Like, I know that sounds weird, but there is only so much they could communicate in tone and the physical expression of the characters on screen. Like, you can tell that Barrett and Yuffie are very high-energy characters based on how they move around in cutscenes, but without voice acting, the way the characters talk to each other is left up to your interpretation, right? Like, this is both why the cast of older Fire Emblem titles are way more pretentious and sophisticated, because they're all being played by me, a horrible cat girl with a theater degree, but also why I have this conflicting energy with Tifa. Like, my understanding of her has been a bit more sturdy, like, in the original, and maybe this really is just a matter of tone, but her lines gave me the impression that she was trying to play it cool with Cloud, that she was aware that there was something really not right with him, but instead of trying to confront him or to try to fawn over him and smother him, she's just trying to be a presence in his life. I get that this is because her secrets, like the stuff that Tifa Lockhart is keeping locked up in her heart, so to speak, will come out in Disc 2, right? And because she doesn't tell Cloud, she isn't honest with him, it hits him at a moment where he is doubting himself the most, and we don't get that part in the remake. That is kind of clawing back at the original problem itself, right? But before we go in for the final blow, I also get that a lot of her character changes were made to deal with the expanded role Midgard plays, so they feel the need to establish a way for the characters to spend time before the plot keeps going. Remember, Tifa is now one of a cast of 4 playable characters for a 40-ish hour game, so she has a much more substantial burden in a part of the game where we really only know a bit of her full story, that she and Cloud were childhood friends, that she clearly cares about him still, and that she may be hiding something from him. A lot of her character comes in after the party leaves Midgar, after all, and a lot of that kind of can't really come up in the remake, so what do? I guess the answer is that Tifa is now like his interim mom, helping him find a place to stay, getting him work, convincing him to take on small jobs, but she's also taking another role that's sort of imposed on her. Following this, the character stuff that happens to Aerith is similar. Like, she's turned into this larger-than-life version of herself. Funny, pushy, assertive, sharp-tongued, prime meme bait. Like, it's easy to appreciate Aerith in this way, but the game does this really subtle thing, right? Like, Aerith is a tricky character in FF7, almost no matter what. Like, she's the last of the Cetra, a race of humanoid aliens that have been taking care of the planet, and can listen to the live stream and hear voices, so it gives Aerith this sort of surreal quality. She's able to tell her adoptive mom that her husband, who was conscripted into the war, died the moment that he did, and so the news wouldn't reach her for months, I can't remember, but it, so it feels like Aerith is something of an oracle, right? And that part gets really amplified in the remake. Like, she kind of predicts the future, of the following games at the end. Like, she can see the whispers before anyone else can, and is the reason the rest of the cast can see them, sort of. Like, they want her to be this mystical presence when, like, she is, but she's not an oracle. Like, she's not out here predicting the future in the original, because, as we discussed, the original made it clear that she doesn't want to die, and the way her character works now kind of implies that it seeks to undermine what was interesting about Aerith as a result. Like, I get that they're doing the Orpheus thing, right? Like, trying to get us to ask if they're going to do it differently this time. But, like, it sucks seeing them exaggerate Aerith into this wisecracking prophet. And it triply sucks because they kind of do the same to Red 13, who, like, he's a boy. He's, like, 40, but he's a boy. Like, his whole character arc, which, again, almost entirely takes place after leaving Midgar, doesn't show him as some kind of, like, mystic with a profound connection to the planet that gives him foresight or whatever. His species sort of watches over the planet, but that's less a supernatural capacity and more like, I don't know. Look, he just has a bunch of knowledge about the Whispers apropos of nothing, and I guess it's an effort to really quickly wrap him into the story so that we don't have to explain to our not-party member why exactly we're fighting. But as a result, Red's character is almost not at all what it was, in a game that's trying to consistently keep us thinking about its original text. I've been dancing around the crux of the issue here for a while now, but there isn't really much else to say there, right? Like, each change brought about in the remake makes sense step by step. They need a new story arc to make it a full game, the new arc needs to be incorporated into the story, they need to preserve the original, they need to expand the cast's depth to fit the new length of the game. All of these make sense, but put all together, the world, the story, the characters all feel like bizarre departures of themselves. It's something that I feel like I should approve of on principle, and if they were committed to just expressing these themes, characters, ideas as a radical departure from the source material, that would be great. But the game is violently trying to be the source material at the same time as it's being a story about the departure from it. This has been an extremely difficult thing for me to get through. I hope that it's been clear that I've been deeply conflicted on how to approach critiquing the game, because there really is a lot to like about it. I remember telling a friend of mine when we first started getting through it that the one thing I could say about the remake in full confidence is that it made me want to play the original again. Like, all of the things that it seeds to get us to Pokemon Go to the store and buy Part 2, or FF7R Integrate, or FF7's 20 other new derivatives. All of these things just make me miss the original. It was this clunky mess of a PS1 title, unquestioningly, but all the fancy details, the bells and whistles, the really vivid voice acting. At its best, the remake makes me long for this idea of itself, something that marries both versions of the game. I like how pretty the remake is, I like the voice actors, but these elements are tied to a version of a game that struggles a lot, almost fundamentally, with the kind of burdens involved in splitting a story apart into a series of stories. Part 1 feels disjointed and clumsy because it carries two almost incompatible burdens, trying to tell us Part 1 of Final Fantasy VII and also be its own meta-take on Final Fantasy VII. Its efforts to complicate the story work to undermine itself, it undercuts Shinra's role, it weakens the intensity of the elements that made the Midgar segment stand out so much, and it leaves us with a product that is gorgeous and deeply conflicted and, frankly, saturated with too much Sephiroth. Whew. Oh my god. Okay, special thanks to Brandon Haney, Caitlin Fisher, Kate Rose, Colleen T, Dector A, Evan Kearns, Lewis Wells, Maria Aladrin, Alistair V, Narai the Redmarked, Pahor, Professor Bopper, Saint Rawberry, Thomas Vulpes, and Zetetic.